Chapter 12 of Patricia, Brent, Spinster. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Anna Simon. Patricia, Brent, Spinster by Herbert Jenkins. Chapter 12. A Bombshell. Good morning, Miss Brent. Patricia was surprised at the graciousness of Mrs. Bonsor's salutation, particularly after the episode of the zoo on the previous afternoon. Good morning, she responded, and made to go upstairs to take off her hat and coat. I congratulate you, proceeded Mrs. Bonsor in honeyed tones, but I'm just a little hurt that you did not confide in me. Mrs. Bonsor's tone was that of a frustrated friend of many years' standing. Confide? Repeated Patricia in a matter-of-fact tone. Confide what, Mrs. Bonsor? Your engagement to Lord Peter Bowen. Such a surprise. You are a very lucky girl. I hope you'll bring Lord Peter to call. Patricia listened mechanically to Mrs. Bonsor's inanities. Suddenly she realized their import. What had happened? How did she know? Had Mr. Triggs told her? How did you know? Patricia inquired. Haven't you seen the Morning Post? Inquired Mrs. Bonsor. The Morning Post? Repeated Patricia in consternation. But I don't understand. Then it isn't true? Inquired Mrs. Bonsor, scenting a mystery. I began Patricia, then with inspiration added, I must be getting on. I've got a lot to do to make up for yesterday. But isn't it true, Miss Brent? Persisted Mrs. Bonsor. Then from halfway up the stairs Patricia turned and, in a spurt of mischief, cried, If you see it in the Morning Post, it is so, Mrs. Bonsor. When Patricia entered the library, Mr. Bonsor was fussing about with letters and papers, a habit he had when nervous. I'm so sorry about yesterday afternoon, Mr. Bonsor, said Patricia. But Mrs. Bonsor seemed to wish me to... Not at all, Miss Brent, said Mr. Bonsor nervously. I... Then he paused. I know what you're going to say, Mr. Bonsor, but please don't say it. Mr. Bonsor looked at her in surprise. Not say it, he said. Oh, everybody's congratulating me, and I'm tired. Shall we get on with the letters? Mr. Bonsor was disappointed. He had prepared a dainty little speech of congratulation, which he had intended to deliver as Patricia entered the room. Mr. Bonsor was always preparing speeches which he never delivered. There was not an important matter that had been before the House since he had represented Little Dollington, upon which he had not prepared a speech. He had criticised every member of the Government and Opposition. He had prepared party speeches and anti-party speeches, patriotic speeches and speeches of protest. He had called upon the House of Commons to save the country, and upon the country to save the House of Commons. He had woven speeches of splendid optimism and speeches of gloomy foreboding. He had attacked ministers and defended ministers, seen himself attacked, and had routed his enemies. He had prepared speeches to be delivered to his servants for domestic misdemeanour, speeches for Mr. Triggs, even for Mrs. Bonsor. He had conceived speeches on pigs, speeches on potatoes, speeches on oil cake, and speeches on officers' wives. In short, there was nothing in the world of his thoughts about which he had not prepared a speech. The one thing he did not do was to deliver these speeches. They were wonderful things of his imagination, which seemed to defy crystallization into words. So it was with the speech of congratulation that he had prepared for Patricia. That morning Patricia was distrait. Her thoughts continued to wander to the Morning Post announcement, and she was anxious to get out to lunch in order to purchase a copy and see what was actually said. Then her thoughts ran on to who was responsible for such an outrage, for Patricia regarded it as an outrage. It was obviously Bowen who had done it in order to make her position still more ridiculous. It was mean. She was not sure that it was not contemptible. Patricia was in the act of transcribing some particulars about infant mortality in England and Wales compared with that of Scotland, when the parlour-maid entered with a note. Mr. Bonsor stretched out his hand for it. It is for Miss Brent, sir, said the maid. Patricia looked up in surprise. It was unusual for her to receive a note at the Bonsors'. She opened the envelope mechanically and read, Dearest, I have just seen the Morning Post. It is sweet of you to relent. You have made me very happy. Will you dine with me tonight, and when may I take you to Grosvenor Square? My mother will want to see her new daughter-in-law. I so enjoyed last night. Surely the gods are on my side. Peter. Patricia read and re-read the note. For a moment she felt ridiculously happy. Then, with a swift change of mood, she saw the humiliation of her situation. Bowen thought it was she who had inserted the notice of the engagement. What must he think of her? It looked as if she had done it to burn his boats behind him. Then suddenly she seized a pen and wrote: Dear Lord Peter, I know nothing whatever about the announcement in the Morning Post, and I only heard of it when I arrived here. I cannot dine with you tonight, and I am very angry and upset that anyone should have had the impertinence to interfere in my affairs. I shall take up the matter with the Morning Post people and insist on a contradiction immediately. Yours sincerely, Patricia Brent. With quick, decisive movements, Patricia folded the note, addressed the envelope and handed it to the maid. Then she turned to Mr. Bonsor. I am sorry to interrupt work, Mr. Bonsor, but that was rather an important note that I had to answer. Mr. Bonsor smiled sympathetically. At lunchtime Patricia purchased a copy of the Morning Post, and there saw in all its unblushing mendacity the announcement. A marriage has been arranged and will shortly take place between Lord Peter Bowen, D.S.O. M.C., attached to the General Staff, son of the 7th Marquess of Mayfield, and Patricia Brent, daughter of the late John Brent of Little Milstead. Why on earth must the ridiculous people put it at the top of the column? She muttered aloud. A man occupying an adjoining table at the place where she was lunching turned and looked at her. And now I must go back to potatoes, pigs and babies, said Patricia to herself as she paid her bill and rose. Ah! She had scarcely settled down to her afternoon's work when the maid entered and announced: Lord Peter Bowen to see you, miss. Oh, bother! Exclaimed Patricia. Tell him I'm busy, will you please? The maid's jaw dropped. She was excellently trained, but no maidservant could be expected to rise superior to such an extraordinary attitude on the part of a newly engaged girl. Nothing short of a butler who had lived in the best families could have risen to such an occasion. But Miss Brent, began Mr. Bonsor. Patricia turned and froze him with a look. Will you give him my message, please, Fellers, she said, and Fellers walked out a disillusioned young woman. 2 minutes later Mrs. Bonsor entered the room, flushed and excited. Oh, Miss Brent, that silly girl has muddled up things somehow. Lord Peter Bowen is waiting for you in the morning room. I've just been talking to him and saying that I hope you will both dine with us one day next week. The message was quite correct, Mrs. Bonsor. I am very busy with pigs and babies and potatoes. I really cannot add Lord Peter to my responsibilities at the moment. Mrs. Bonsor looked at Patricia as if she had suddenly gone mad. But Miss Brent, began Mrs. Bonsor, scandalized. I suppose I shall have to see him, said Patricia, rising with the air of one who has to perform an unpleasant task. I wish he'd stay at the War Office and leave me to do my work. I suppose I shall have to write to Lord Derby about it. Mrs. Bonsor glanced at Mr. Bonsor, who, however, was busily engaged in preparing an appropriate speech upon the War Office methods suggested by Patricia's remark about Lord Derby. As Patricia entered the morning room, Bowen came forward. Oh, Patricia, why will you persist in being a cold douche? Why, this morning I absolutely scandalized Peel by singing at the top of my voice whilst in my bath. And now, look at me now. Patricia looked at him. Then she was forced to laugh. He presented such a woebegone appearance. But what on earth have I to do with your singing in your bath? She inquired. It was the Morning Post paragraph. I thought everything was going to be all right after last night, and now I'm a doormat again. Who inserted that paragraph? Enquired Patricia. I rang up the Morning Post office, and they told me that it was handed in by Miss Brent, who is staying at the Mayfair Hotel. Aunt Adelaide. There was a depth of meaning in Patricia's tone as she uttered the two words. Then, turning to Bowen, she inquired, Did you tell them to contradict it? They asked me whether it were correct, he said, refusing to meet Patricia's eyes. What did you say? I said it was. He looked at her quizzically, like a boy who is expecting a severe scolding. Patricia had to bite her lips to prevent herself from laughing. You told the Morning Post people that it was correct when you knew that it was wrong? Bowen hung his head. But it isn't wrong, he muttered. You know very well that it is wrong, and that I am not engaged to you, and that no marriage has been arranged or ever will be arranged. Now I shall have to write to the editor and insist upon the statement being contradicted. Good Lord, don't do that, Patricia, broke in Bowen. They'll think we've all gone mad. And for once a newspaper editor will be right, was Patricia's comment. " And will you dine to-night